Hey everybody, I've gone over your mill posts. I haven't graded them all yet, but I went through them because I knew I would want to post something about some of the issues that are a little bit tricky with mill. So here I have, was it four or five points I wanted to clarify with you before the exam. So let's do this on mill. First is you all did a good job of recognizing the basic premise of Mill's philosophy, which is that unlike Kant, for Mill, the most important fact about human beings is that we can experience pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering, right? Now remember, for Kant, the most important thing about human beings and the part of human beings that you have to respect all the time, no matter what, is our reason, which gives us the capacity to make free choices. For Kant, morality is rooted in human freedom. And if someone is not free to make a choice, we don't hold them responsible. When someone is free to make a choice, a 25-year-old as opposed to a 3-year-old, then we hold them responsible. We praise them for what they do, and we blame them for what they do because we believe they're free. For Mill, that may be true, but the most important fact about human nature for him is that we can experience pleasure and pain. And he thinks everyone is interested in more happiness, more pleasure, and less pain and suffering. So on the basis of that, you were all correct to think that for Mill, other creatures who can experience happiness and misery, pleasure and pain, should also be counted in our moral considerations. Kant, not so much. Wouldn't care so much about animal suffering. He might say we should, as human beings, we should be kind, but not because animals deserve any kind of respect. But for Mill, animals have to be included sheerly from the fact that they can experience pleasure and pain. So we'll get to that in a little more detail. But the second point, several of you wrote that our treatment of animals in terms of, say, using them for food or for animal testing or putting them in zoos or maybe even having them as pets, some of you wrote that all of those cases where we are delivering any kind of suffering to animals would be wrong for Mill, and he would not allow us to do it. So one of you said morality for Mill never involves delivering pain. And that would seem to be the case based on what we've said so far, but actually it's not accurate. The important thing to understand for Mill is he is trying to tell us how to make moral choices. And he recognizes that usually in life, almost all the time in life, we never have perfect choices. We never have choices that allow us to avoid all forms of potential suffering or pain. Sometimes we do, but those are fairly trivial kinds of events. If we're making decisions on a large scale, such as the issue we're discussing, how should we as a society deal with animals and how should we treat them, Mill is going to recognize that none of our choices are going to be perfect. There's going to be some suffering no matter what we do. So, instead of saying morality never involves delivering pain, we have to recognize that Mill would say, look at your choices honestly, look at what we can do as a society. Giving up meat completely is one choice. Closing all the zoos is one choice. I mean, these are choices, but we have other choices. We have to look at each of the choices, try to calculate and predict the total amount of pleasure and pain that will be produced by each choice, and then choose the best out of those realistic choices. And again, what turns out to be the best choice among those we have is probably going to involve still inflicting some suffering, right? So if we ban meat completely, human beings are going to be angry. Human beings who like to eat meat are going to be angry. That's a form of suffering. It might be the best choice, though, among our other choices. So that is much more how Mill looks at it. He's not an absolutist in saying inflicting pain is always wrong. We have to be realistic about the choices we have. Number 3. Many of you concluded that Mill would say it is immoral to eat animals, that Mill would be against using animals for food. And again, it seems reasonable to conclude that from what he said, and that it might be right that in this circumstance, say in today's age, he might argue that we don't need to eat meat and that we should therefore not eat meat. But again, he doesn't have an absolute rule against it. How would he look at it? Well, he would say, first of all, that having meat for human beings is a good thing, in the sense that it tastes delicious to many of us, so having delicious things is good. Remember, for Mill, all pleasure is good. So all of that is good, and it provides nutrition for us, which is important to our health, and health is important for our happiness. So in those two very, very basic ways, Mill would recognize that eating meat provides us with happiness. And that would be important to him. He's not going to ignore that. On the other hand, as we've said from the beginning, he would agree that animal experience, suffering and happiness, have to be included in our moral thinking. So we can't ignore the fact that in order to eat meat, you have to kill animals. Right? They're going to suffer, obviously. So these are two basic facts that we begin with. So I'm not going to go into the details. It doesn't really matter, all the details of how he would look at it. But this is how I always teach this. Right? He does this. He's weighing things. On one hand, meat gives us pleasure and nutrition. On the other hand, it causes animal suffering. How are we going to calculate both sides of this? I think he would ask something like, if we need to eat meat, if we want to eat meat, we say that's a good thing. Would it be okay for us to torture animals, to inflict severe suffering and pain upon them in order for us to have a delicious meal? And most of us would say, no, we've crossed a line somehow, that if we're torturing animals in order for us to have a delicious meal, we're not giving the animals enough credit. We're not taking their experience into account. And so he would ask, how are we treating the animals that we eat? Does it constitute torture? Is it close to torture? And can we get the pleasure that we receive from meat without inflicting as much suffering and harm on those animals as we're inflicting now? So in general, he would want us to look at not just the fact that we're killing animals, because, ironically for Mill, killing an animal ends its suffering. Kind of an odd, he wouldn't say that that's a reason to kill, to end suffering, unless someone is terminally ill, perhaps. But I think he would really focus on this question. When these animals are alive, what is the quality of their experience? Are we allowing them to live as rich and fun and interesting and happy a life as they can while they're alive? Then the question of, do we need to kill them for meat? Can we find pleasure from other foods without killing them? Is part of the equation, but not the whole equation at all. It's possible we would calculate that given the human love for meat and the need for nutrition, maybe we'll say we can't get it from other sources, although that's really not the case. Nonetheless, if we calculate that human beings are going to suffer without meat, I think he would say then it's our obligation to treat those animals while they're alive as well as possible to minimize the overall suffering. Okay, fourth point. Some of you concluded that because animals experience pleasure and pain, that we should treat them equal to or as we treat other human beings. And again, that's reasonable that you would say that given what Mill says, that animals should be included, but he would ask whether or not the capacity for experiencing pleasure and pain are equivalent between humans and other animals. And there may be a scale to this, right? It may be that a chicken can experience more pleasure and pain than an ant or a robin. I don't know. Scientists study this. It's a field called ethology, which is sort of the study of the experience of animals and the culture of animals. In any case, if we know that animals can feel pleasure or pain, that doesn't mean for Mill that we have to treat them equivalent to humans, not because humans have free choice, that's Kant, but because, for example, animals, while they share with us, let's say, pleasure in eating food, pleasure in having sex, pleasure in maybe running around, pleasure in feeling the sunshine and hanging out, in the barnyard or something like this, that those are things that we can also enjoy. I don't think animals have the capacity for experiencing the great rewards of things like friendship, pride in oneself, great sense of accomplishment when you finish a big project, right? Maybe you graduate from college. There's a great happiness, a sort of depth of pride there. On the other hand, shame. I don't know that animals can feel shame or regret. And now you can begin to think about the dozens of different complex social emotions that you probably experience every hour of every day, involving your past and your future and your relationships and your ex and your mom and your cousin and your grandma and right? Human beings have a very, very complicated emotional life that I'm pretty sure animals are not capable of. So in that sense, Mill would say, we need to take animals into account because they can feel pleasure and pain, but that doesn't mean we give them the same weight as human beings, because they're simply not able to experience emotions at the same level of complexity that human beings can. So we include them, but still recognize that they fall short of the human capacity for emotions. And all of this, right, every single thing I've said here, for Mill, comes down to the same question. It's this question of how much, right? So when a chicken is locked in a cage for its whole life and doesn't have sunshine, doesn't have freedom, it is suffering. How much suffering can we say there is compared to, let's say, the suffering of a chicken, someone who loves the meat of chicken and is told they have to be a vegetarian? That's a different kind of suffering for a different creature. It's this kind of how much. And the idea of utilitarianism is that we're only going to be useful in addressing the suffering of the world, in adding happiness to the world, if we're objective and honest in calculating how much suffering and happiness is involved in our choices. We have to include animals. How much do we include them? We try to be honest about that. And then among the choices we have, realistically, make the one that produces the most happiness and the least amount of suffering for every creature involved. Okay, finally, a couple related issues were the existence of zoos and the practice of animal testing. And notice again, in these cases, you have real human needs versus the experience of the animals involved. Zoos provide us a sense of our connection with nature. They're educational for us. For whatever reasons, we enjoy just watching these animals close up and smelling them and being close to them. On the other hand, the animals are not in the wild anymore. They're not able to really have a group or a community for those animals that are more social. And they're out of their natural element. One has to presume that doesn't feel good. Animal testing, very similar. Sometimes we use animals to test for medical conditions that will save lives or cure diseases. Let me just leave you with, I think, the most important question that Mill would ask about this. When we say that human happiness is fulfilled by a zoo or is fulfilled by animal testing, Mill is not going to deny that, but this would be his challenge. He would say, have we worked hard enough to find alternative ways of having those pleasures or reducing that suffering, let's say, curing disease? Have we worked hard enough to find other ways of achieving the same good results for human beings, ways that don't involve inflicting cruelty on animals, or don't involve inflicting as much cruelty on animals? So again, he's not going to say, we need to treat animals as equal to humans, and he's not saying that there's no good in zoos and no good in animal testing, because the goods are what happiness they bring to us, right? Health, etc., curing disease. But he's going to say the moral thing to do is to seek ways of achieving those important goals while reducing, if not eliminating, the animal suffering that we are now inflicting in order to achieve them. So it's always about being realistic, and it's always about finding the best alternative that maximizes happiness, which is always good for Mill, and which minimizes suffering, whether it's ours or the suffering of other creatures. Okay, so I hope that helps clarify some of the misunderstandings that I found. Good luck on the test. I'll talk to you soon.